This anime season has been absolutely killing it with the pure fantasy, non-isekai genre. Frieren was a healing show that will probably win Anime of the Year for me. The Spice and Wolf remake is another classic that I'm excited to sit down and watch again. And last but not least is Dungeon Meshi. And wow, this one is a feast for the eyes, and your stomach too. The way they present the food is immaculate. The world building is evocative, and the characters, we have Marcille, another elf woman who was hot off the trails of Frieren for being a top heroine of the season. We have our curt and serious Chilichuck, a half-foot rogue or thief of the party. We have Senshi, our resident cook, frontline, and fan service material apparently. And finally, we have the main character, Laios. Laios is the party's leader in Dungeon Meshi. He and his compatriots are delving into the ancient dungeon to recover Fallon, Laios' sister, who was swallowed up by a red dragon. Laios is a peculiar character, to say the least. He's fairly socially awkward and quirky, but is a reliable friend to have with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of monsters within the dungeon. Due to some of these quirks, many online spaces and enjoyers of Dungeon Meshi have been comparing these traits to a certain spectrum disorder that also relates to communicating and interacting with others. Hi, I go by Guy, and today we're going to examine the Dungeon Meshi anime and answer the following question. Does Laios have autism? First, I want to acknowledge that diagnosing anyone with autism spectrum disorder is a complicated process that involves many assessments, reports from childhood, interviews with parents, schools, and other sources of information to arrive at a solid conclusion. If it were as easy as noticing obsessions or quirks, well, many diagnostic career prospects would be looking dim. Before we tackle our main question, let's first understand what autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is. The first question could make for a brief video by itself, but I'll try to contain the immense nuance of a highly contentious and disputed topic in about 2, maybe 3 minutes. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. It is referred to as a spectrum disorder due to the wide variation in types and severity of symptoms experienced by others. These symptoms are typically related to social communication or interactions and restrictive or repetitive behaviors. Social communication and interaction behaviors affect, well, communication and interaction. This can be something like making little eye contact with people or having facial expressions that don't match what is being said or its context. Restrictive and repetitive behaviors are behaviors that limit a person's focus, interest, or activity. This includes having an intense and specific interest in certain topics, replaying the same song or film repeatedly, or repeating the words or noises made by others, such as in the case of echolalia. These are just drops in the bucket about the potential symptoms that may show up in someone diagnosed with autism. And I'm sure some of these examples may sound familiar. Social media has been saturated with content related to autism. We've probably seen a video that says 10 signs you may be autistic or 6 quirks that people with autism have while scrolling on Instagram or TikTok. However, it is important to note that many of these are just potential traits, features, or symptoms. Context is important when looking at some of the associated characteristics of ASD. For example, eye contact. While it can be a potential symptom of autism, there can be underlying factors that impact that behavior. In certain cultural communities, looking others in the eye could be considered disrespectful. All this to say, while these traits help identify signs of autism, it doesn't automatically mean that someone has a diagnosis of it. Nonetheless, we'll do our best to answer the following question. Does Laios meet diagnostic criteria for ASD? One major consideration we have to make is that autism is reliably diagnosed around childhood, with it becoming more difficult to diagnose as age increases. Laios, being 26 years old, will make diagnosing considerably harder. To do that, we're going to compare some observations of Laios that we see in the anime to what is presented in the DSM-5 TR's criteria. Starting from the top, Criteria A is defined as persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. The DSM-5 showcases 3 sub-criteria with 3 needed to satisfy diagnostic criteria A. It is important to note that these examples are not exhaustive due to the spectrum nature of ASD. The first symptom they identify is deficits in social-emotional reciprocity. This is showcased by having abnormal social approaches and having difficulty in having a contextually normal back and forth conversation. This is also highlighted by reduced sharing of interests, emotions, and feelings, as well as limited ability to initiate or respond to social interactions. Laios is many things. He's awkward at times, quirky, and does a great impression of a dog. And he's also fairly social and able to respond to others and their emotions. We see Laios have many back and forth conversations with his party members throughout the show without any indicated difficulty. He has no difficulty in sharing his interest during interactions either. I mean, just listen to how he talks about monsters and food.
All right, I admit it. I do love monsters. I love how they look, how they sound, how they live, and I always wondered how they taste. I think it's neat how the male and female coin bugs have different faces. Found some! Beautiful dryad fruits!
Even though Laios is fairly social, others have consistently misconstrued his words due to his difficulty in noticing social cues and being rather blunt.
He's a psychopath.
For example, he stated he would have never been able to try so many different foods if the dragon hadn't eaten Fallon, even wishing she was there to clarify what he meant when everybody got mad at him. Laios has trouble communicating his intentions, which leads to his party constantly misunderstanding his emotions and feelings. We'll check this box for Laios. The second symptom focuses on deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors for social interaction. Examples of these can be difficulty in understanding verbal and nonverbal communication. The DSM also lists abnormalities in eye contact, body language, or difficulty understanding and using gestures. Examples could be not recognizing shrugging as a sign of confusion or very little to very extended eye contact. On the extreme end, we may observe a total lack of facial expressions being used and complete nonverbal communication. Regarding these traits, Laios appears to understand and even use nonverbal communication in many social interactions and doesn't appear to be contextually abnormal. There are some areas where this could be present though. Laios talks with others wearing a relatively unremarkable, calm expression. However, when he begins to talk about topics he's interested in, his gestures become wild and he practically flails his arms around. His over-the-top expressions tend to be off-putting to his party as well. And while this can be seen as an exaggeration for comedy, this could potentially be another behavioral trait of autism. However, it is hard to say that this is the case because these observations were made as an adult. Nonetheless, we'll check this box for Laios. And that finally leaves us with the third symptom: deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. The DSM-5 mentioned difficulties adjusting behavior to suit the social context, making friends, and having a lack of interest in peers. Laios has friends. He has party members and has a very cool and dope magical sister that used to accompany him. You know, before the... That is to say, while Laios has meaningful relationships, it is stated time and time again by Laios and others that he has difficulty understanding relationships and reading the room. Looking briefly at what we can see from Laios' past in the anime, we see parts of his life where he and his sister were gold peelers, people who would venture into the dungeon and peel off the gold on its many surfaces for profit. He would donate his funds to his previous friends who couldn't enter the dungeon due to injuries. While noble, this would continue even after his previous comrades had long recovered, exploiting his good nature. While this could be chalked up to an overall sense of goodness or naivety on part of Laios, it can be indicative of his lack of understanding of the nature of those relationships. Quick aside, I want to stress that people with autism are not inherently naive. This is a dated and infantilizing trope that is inaccurate and one I will always stress to others. To further support this point, we have that large fight with Shuro, one of Laios' ex-party members. It is during this fight that Shuro voices his frustrations about Laios and being
thick-headed and awkward.
Shuro confessed that he had loved Fallon, that Laios was too dense, and that Laios had the worst timing with him unintentionally getting in between his attempts to be with Fallon. He even states that he dropped hints that any other person would have noticed to indicate this. This can potentially relate to example 2 of not understanding the nuance of nonverbal/verbal communication, but let's be real, we're gonna chalk this up to the lack of communication on Shuro's part.
If it was so hard to be around me, you should have told me back then so I knew!
Following up on that, Shuro in general is a bad communicator. Hell, he even straight up asked Fallon to marry him before ever confessing his feelings to her. So we can potentially chalk that up to both of them failing to solve their issues by just talking it out. Lastly, from Laios' dream with the nightmare, we see that he has had a history of not fitting in many contexts from childhood. We see that he left school and the army due to difficulties fitting in. Laios has held on to these feelings and memories since childhood, confirming a history of difficulties in reading people and understanding relationships from a young age. We'll mark Laios here too. In total, Laios marked 3 of the potential symptoms that are needed to meet criteria A for autism spectrum disorder. Criteria B is associated with previously mentioned restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. There are 4 symptoms with Laios needing at least 2 of the traits to meet diagnostic criteria B. Behavior 1 involves repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. Examples of this could be repetitive head nodding or shaking your hands. The use of objects could be lining up toys or belongings in a particular order, and for speech, they utilize the example of echolalia, but it could also be making a repeated sound. This criterion consists of what is commonly called stimming or self-stimming behavior. Laios hasn't obviously or consistently shown these behaviors throughout the anime. However, one moment that particularly stands out is his uncanny ability to make dog sounds, something that Fallon notes that he was good at as a child. You see, it is not uncommon for children with autism to mimic animal sounds when engaging in stimming behavior. It could be inferred that Laios' uncanny ability to mimic dogs is due to this stimming behavior that he performed as a child. But because I am unable to confirm this, I will chalk this up to a question mark for now. Behavior 2 is the insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal/nonverbal behaviors. When considering this, think about having a strong response to a small change throughout the day that could put everything at a standstill. The reaction to not having this sameness can result in a distressing reaction for someone who may have this trait. For Laios, this one is tricky. When looking at insistence behaviors from Laios, we potentially see it with one behavior while in the series, and that's eating. Laios had a consistent desire and adherence to eating 3 square meals a day and consistently staying well fed, going so far as to eat monsters as they delved into the dungeon. He even stated the importance of eating and staying well fed when he first fought the Red Dragon and while delivering Shuro them f***ing hands.
We've been eating 3 meals a day and getting sleep, which means we're able to take this more seriously than anyone else can!
Now, even though he showcased this trait of insistence on a routine eating schedule, we have to consider one of the most important parts of psychological diagnosis, and that is context. Laios recently lost his sister due to exhaustion from hunger. We also know he is an experienced adventurer in the dungeon, knowing how impactful hunger can affect your ability to fight, concentrate, and remain composed under pressure. So of course, he's going to have an insistence on eating. Nearly all of them are. Well, maybe not as much as Senshi.
So unhealthy. We've been walking non-stop and haven't had a decent meal since eating the dragon. I'm overwhelmed with shame that I can't provide a hearty meal at such an important time in their lives. I must feed them. The youngins must be fed, and I have to feed them!
But the point is that this insistence is normal within the context of their environment. And without knowledge of this also being the case throughout his life, we can't say that he holds this trait of autism spectrum disorder. So we will put this as a no. Example 3 revolves around highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Y'all,
I always loved monsters that were a mix of more than one.
Whenever I saw suits of armor holding hands,
I thought
it was a dungeon
Start an
duck, but maybe
incision
that
at
was
its
me.
belly.
Dire ducks with man-eating green onions. Now there's
It produces fluid strands. The tail of us reconstructed it with the wear and tear a normal road would have.
beautiful dryad fruits.
anyways. Behavior 4 revolves around hyper, meaning increased, and hypo, meaning decreased reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. This could be hypersensitivity to bright lights, adverse reactions to certain sounds, excessive touching of certain textures, or fascination or fixation with a particular temperature. This isn't observed in Laios throughout the series, except for that one instance of him lying in the snow and stating that he doesn't like it when it's hot. So this one is another symptom not met. In total, Laios met one of the symptoms for criteria B and has a question mark for another. We will address this later. Criterion C states that the symptoms must be present in the early developmental period of life, typically as a child. And as discussed earlier with Laios' nightmare, it appeared that this has occurred ever since he was younger and throughout his life. As such, we can mark Criterion C as met for the most part. Criterion D states that the diagnostic symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of current functioning. Once again referencing the nightmare and his gold peeling experience, Laios had a history of not feeling like he belonged to a particular space. This caused him to leave school, leave the army, and even leave his gold peeling job, showing that his communication difficulties have impaired him in an occupational area. Lastly, Criterion E specifies that the disturbances are not better explained by intellectual developmental disorder or global developmental delay. Laios meets this criterion as he doesn't have the other two disorders as far as we know. Now let's take a look at all our criteria. We already know that he passes criteria C, D, and E, leaving our focus on criteria A and B. Criteria A had to do with deficits in social communication and social interaction. To meet this criteria, he needed 3 symptom from the list. Laios showcased a deficit in social emotional reciprocity and in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, meeting diagnostic criteria A. For criteria B, he needed to exhibit 2 restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. While Laios showed one of the symptoms being a fixated interest, he doesn't clearly or consistently showcase the other symptoms. So Laios doesn't meet criteria B. Does that mean that we can't diagnose him with autism spectrum disorder? And the answer is, I'm somewhat stuck myself. Now wait, hold on. I promise I didn't just waste your time. Are we able to diagnose Laios exactly according to the criteria of the DSM-5-TR? Technically, no. But that is primarily because we don't have enough information to go off in the first place. As stated previously, autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental one that is highlighted during developmental ages. With Laios being 26 years old, the possibility exists that potential symptoms are being masked. Masking being efforts made to hide or suppress traits of autism to meet social expectations and be accepted in society. For us to attribute these behaviors to ASD, we need to know if these behaviors were present during childhood, or if they developed at some point later. Besides his dog impressions, the anime doesn't give us enough context for these behaviors. For example, his expressiveness could be a learned behavior from his family or a product of tall man culture. We simply don't have enough information, and we can't ask Fallon because, yeah. If Laios were in my office, we would be asking about his comprehensive history and interviewing his parents, work, school, and peers, and all the other stuff. But we can't. And that is why I'm stuck with this diagnosis and why autism is often hard to address as well. It is simple to identify potential traits of ASD, but to assign a diagnosis without looking at the broader picture and context, it's too difficult. So to summarize all that, does Laios have autism? It's likely. But it would be irresponsible to say for sure without a clinical assessment by a professional. Laios has a connection with monsters due to his increased interest in their biology, behavior, and potential taste. Yet for all of his banes and boons, he's on the road to becoming the ruler of this delicious dungeon. And I'm excited to see what's on the menu for Season 2. Whew, thanks for watching the video. This one was pretty fun to make. While I really enjoyed watching it, I'm sad to see it go for the season. But it did give me a good idea for another dungeon related video, which will be coming out eventually. Nonetheless, if you liked this meal, leave a greasy-handed like and tell me what dish you would like to try from Dungeon Meshi in the comments. I personally want to try the Exorcism sorbet because it's getting warmer and honestly, it's just such a weird food. It's weird, it's funny, it's goofy. There's weird little coin bugs in it. I just want it in my mouth. And make sure to leave a suggestion on what you'd like to see discussed next while you're there. But once again, I'm Guy, and thank you for watching.